We're gonna get started. We have like 500 people on the call today. This is super cool. This is really cool to see everyone coming out. I want to get started. Before we get into cold calling, I think that the important thing to do is to kind of think about how what we're doing in our sales life applies to our personal life and vice versa. So I got a little survey question for you guys. I'm really curious to know because when we're cold calling, we're essentially starting conversations with complete strangers, which, I don't know about you, that makes me a bit nervous to think about talking to a complete stranger, especially, maybe COVID right now doesn't really help, with that either. But let me know in the chat, how often do you initiate conversations with complete strangers outside of work? So not the stuff you do in your sales job. Is it 1 to 3 times a week, 4 to 6, 7+, never? Let me know in the chat. We're kind of all over the board, which is interesting. Hey, John, what's going on? And it's a little bit tougher, I know now, with COVID. Personally, for me, it's probably A, which might seem kind of weird. I'm a bit introverted. Starting conversations with complete strangers is actually something that makes me very uneasy to do in most cases. It's an area that I'm personally pushing myself in. Yeah, interesting. So it looks like we're kind of all over the place. The reason why I asked that again is I want you to think about the things that get in the way of you starting conversations with complete strangers, that maybe anxiety that you feel, that lack of curiosity in the other person we'll kind of connect it here in a second, could really impact the way that you treat cold calling as well. So what I want to get into with you today is how do we go from reluctant to confident? So how do we make cold calling this thing that we don't really kind of maybe like to do, we don't feel comfortable doing, to something that we feel very confident as a way to land meetings for us? All right. So Gong's got some really interesting data around this, and I'm curious to see what the 2021 stat looks like. But with all of their data, what they showed is that there's about a 1.48% chance of a positive outcome from a cold call. I don't know the exact math. I think that's about 50 to 60 cold calls in order to have a positive outcome. And I don't know about you, I don't like those odds. I do not like them at all. That's a lot of work to create a meeting from a cold call. Yeah, Casey said, ouch. Definitely. I like to think about Outbound as a game of odds. And the odds, they're a 1 in 50, 1 in 60 chance that you have a positive outcome from a cold call. Those are not really great odds. What I want to talk to you about today is how we can increase those odds to 5%, 10%. Some of the best cold callers in our programs like Outbound Squad and some of the best clients that I work with, they have reps sometimes that are in that 30, 35% range. So what I want you to think about is, how do we increase our odds? How do we apply a few principles so that when we make the decision to talk to a person that did not ask us to call them, how do we increase our odds of success? So I want to talk to you about a couple of things. So the big problems are this. What I see is a problem with how do we get past that first 30 seconds? I see reps getting shut down with literally within the first 10 seconds of the call. So what do we need to really do to nail the first 30 seconds? I'm seeing a lot of pitches falling short too. So clunky sounding elevator pitches, value prop statements. I'm seeing a lot of things where we talk a lot about, at XYZ company, we do this and that. I'd like to set up a meeting with you to talk further, and people getting shut down there. And then once you get past that intro part of the call, oftentimes a struggle and problem that I see too is where to go next. I don't know about you guys. Sometimes it's when you get someone, whether that's talking to a stranger in person or someone on a cold call, sometimes it's hard to get into an actual, conversation. You're talking at the person, but it doesn't really feel like there's a lot of dialogue back and forth. So here's the opportunity, and what I want to cover with you so that it doesn't feel like you are being forced to eat vegetables like you were as a kid. I remember having to eat canned vegetables as a kid, especially canned carrots and green beans. I just was not a fan of it. So we don't want cold calling to feel like this. The opportunity is, how do we choose conversations over meetings? So what I want you to think about is, how can we take all the pressure off ourselves to get a meeting from someone? Because I don't know about you, I don't like talking to people who I can tell need something from me or want something from me or have some sort of agenda. So how do we take the pressure off and have a conversation and focus on that instead of the conversion? The second thing that we're going to talk about is how we can use structure over scripts. So what I'm not going to give you today is a word for word bullet pointed thing and say, hey, these are the magic words, say this is going to work every time. That does not exist. Does not exist. So how do we choose structure and follow a structure versus focusing on the exact words to say? And then we're going to talk about priorities over pitches. The way that I teach cold calling is to not pitch at all. What we're going to talk about is how to talk about the prospect and get them talking instead of pitching to them. What I want you to walk away with this is a structure and a framework that will give you bulletproof confidence. Not by the end of this webinar, that would be way too big of a promise. But what I want to give you by the end of this webinar is a structure that you can start using and practicing so you can feel more confident. So to get started, I want to make this session as actionable as possible for you. What I would love to hear from you in the chat, I want your participation here, is where do you feel like you were having the most challenges with your cold calls? Get really specific. Is it the intro? Are you getting objections? Do you not feel confident? Do you deal with call reluctance? Get super specific for me. And then we're going to get into the content. Yeah, so people not answering. Ryan, check out my LinkedIn post from today. There should be some stuff there to help you. So the first 30 seconds, Matt says. Yeah, first 30 seconds. Yeah, gatekeepers, call reluctance, not feeling confident, Robin says. Hey, Robin. Yeah, handling objections, making the call important to them, value prop, the first 5 seconds. Marianne says she gets hung up on the intro, turning a no into a yes. Yeah, confidence, intro. Cool. Okay, I think we're going to be talking about the right stuff today. I always like to do a little pulse check. Okay, so one little rule here. If you have a question that comes up, if you could, just because I'm doing all of this by myself here, if you could drop the question into the Q&A button. So click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, put your questions in there. That'll kind of separate them from the rest of the chat so that if we have time, what I can do is get to some of those questions. All right, so there's 3 key ideas that I want you to walk away with. First, we're going to talk about how to think outside of the script. So we're going to step outside of the cold call first, and I'm going to talk about call reluctance. The next thing I'm going to talk about is how to reverse engineer the cold call. So you're going to get a structure that we could walk through from step A to step Z. So how to intro, how to hook the prospect, how to close. The last thing that we're going to do is talk about objections, but we're not going to talk about how to do rebuttals and things like that. We're going to talk about how to actually handle objections using empathy. And it's not really about turning a no into a yes. It's more about understanding where the other person is coming from so that we can have a really good conversation with them. All right. So let's get into it. All right, so let's talk about call reluctance. Call reluctance is kind of an interesting topic because, and what I'm going to share with you, by the way, you can use this framework to deal with any kind of reluctance. All right. Call reluctance, though, I feel like we approach this in the wrong way. And before we dig into the framework, the goal with reluctance or any type of fear is not to conquer the fear. The goal is not to conquer the fear. So I'll give you an example, like going into a webinar like this, I get kind of nervous and get some butterflies because there's several hundred people on here and I don't want this to be a fucking waste of your time. You know, I don't want to waste anyone's time. I want to give some actionable things. So for me, I get kind of nervous coming into this. The goal is not to make those nerves go away or to feel less anxious necessarily. The goal is to get comfortable and do the action anyways. Okay, so the first thing that I want you to wrap your head around is that it's not about getting rid of the reluctance. If you deal with call reluctance, it's about doing it scared. Okay, there's a whole book on that that's kind of interesting too. I'm going to give you a framework that you can think about it. But the point here is to do it scared. It's not to make the reluctance go away. It's not to make the fear go away. That's going to be present. It's more about how you deal with that, which I'm going to give you a framework for here in a second. All right, so step number 1 is we need to identify the pattern. That's the easy part. So for any of you in the chat that said, I deal with call reluctance, you've identified a pattern that sometimes you don't pick up the phone because you were too afraid to talk to the person on the other end, or it makes you too uneasy, or it makes you too anxious, whatever it might be. So you've already done step 1, identify the pattern. Now, steps 2 and 3 is where we can start to have some fun. So what I want to do real quick is pinpoint the trigger. Okay. I'm going to give you a funny example to use along with this to get you thinking, and then we'll apply it to cold calling here in a second. Okay, so I'll give you an example for me. One thing that I do a lot is I like cooking. And my wife, Sarah, is, I would say she's very particular about the food that I cook. And she's, pretty particular about how it tastes, of course. And a lot of times when I've cooked things in the past, pasta is something I like to cook a lot. I'll maybe over or under season or salt the pasta. Now, what would happen in this case, the pattern that we'd slip into is Sarah would say, hey, Jason, I think there's way too much salt in the food. And I would get triggered. I would get kind of pissed. And what I would be thinking is, well, you didn't do the cooking. I did the cooking. I cooked the meal. You should be appreciative of this. That's where my head goes, right? So when I pinpoint the trigger, what I started working on, this is through a lot of work with my therapist, is I started thinking about what is the exact moment where I get triggered? What is the exact moment in time? What is literally the exact thing that happens, that's said? How do I feel? All of that kind of stuff. And I found that the trigger for me was when someone has critique for something that I spent a lot of time in, I take it personally because I feel like she is telling me I am a bad cook instead of saying this food wasn't salted correctly. I would take it really personally. So what I started to do is anytime I got feedback, I pinpointed the trigger and then I would start to derail and replace. So what I would do is instead of saying, hey, she thinks I'm a bad cook, she's not appreciative of this, I started to derail and replace that thinking. And in the moment, I would tell myself, oh, dang, I spent all this time cooking a meal that I hope that she would enjoy. And for whatever reason, it's not pleasant for her. That's kind of a bummer for her. Like, how can I focus on her and what she's thinking and take it less personally, right? So let's think about how this applies to cold calling. So you've identified this pattern that, hey, I become call reluctant. If we start to pinpoint the trigger, what I want from you in the chat here is where I can help kind of coach you guys as a group here, is I want you to think about the exact moment in time that you feel the reluctance and what is the story that you tell yourself. And by the way, a lot of you guys are throwing stuff into the chat. If you want me to answer a question, the best place to throw it into is the Q&A. All right, so put the questions in the Q&A. So in the chat, though, help me out. If you deal with call reluctance, what is the exact moment in time that you feel it? Is it when you open up the person's LinkedIn profile and you look at their picture and you're like, oh my God, this person looks like such an intimidating person. Like they're definitely going to say no to me. When is the exact moment in time that you feel it? And what is the story that you're telling yourself? Yeah, so Sandra Prakash, I know I'm totally butchering your name. Apologies. He said they would say no, so why bother calling? That's the story that they tell themselves. Yeah, hey, I might fail. God, I might feel really bad when they straight up tell me no and they don't even listen to me. John says, when I see their job title, when the phone is ringing, Anna says, when they answer, if they have a negative tone. Yeah, Rebecca says they're not interested. They look kind of intimidating. I don't know about you. I look at people's LinkedIn profiles sometimes. You play mind games with yourself. Yeah, when I look at the phone to dial in says, when I see their job title, when I see they're using a competitor. Yeah, when the phone is dialing. Okay. So I'm going to write some of these down. So let's say phone is dialing. And we tell ourselves a story that, hey, they wouldn't want to hear from us because they're using a competitor. Or why would they bother with me? Let's use those two as an example. So what we're going to want to do here, oh yeah, Leslie, that's a really good one too. Hey, they're super important. Am I? There's almost this like, I feel like I'm talking to a grown-up and I'm a little kid kind of thing going on, right? Let me write that one down. They're really busy or important. Okay, so what we want to do here, there's a couple strategies that we can do to derail this, okay? So let me zoom in a bit. So one, what I want you to think about, and let me actually erase that. Let's use a smaller pen. What I want you to think about is being rejected versus being the person who rejects the other person. So what I want you to do is think about what it's like to be the other person. And specifically what you can think about is, what has it been like in your life when you reject someone? So think about if you've ever had to turn down someone that was interested in you, that maybe wanted to date you. Think about someone that wanted to be friends with you more than you wanted to be with them. Think about what that felt like. Unless you're a sociopath, it probably didn't feel good to reject the person, to say, you know what? No, or to ignore them, right? You might feel like, oh God, like I feel like such a jerk, but I have to be honest with this person because I don't like them. Your prospects, you guys, they're feeling the same thing. Most prospects do not like to reject salespeople, especially if you come in and you have a really good attitude about it and you're trying to be helpful. I want you to just sit in the seat of the person that you're calling for a second and think about, you know what? It's not easy for this person to reject me either. So I might have a fear coming in, not wanting to get rejected, but you know what? They also are uncomfortable rejecting me. It's a two-way street, okay? So the second thing that you can think about, I said this before, is conversations over conversions. So if we zoom out a little bit, instead of thinking, hey, they're using a competitor, why would they even bother talking to me? Oh, they seem really busy. I don't even want you to think about whether or not you could get a meeting from this person. What I want you to think about is, if they're using a competitor, I wonder how they like the competitor. I wonder if they know about this specific thing that we might be able to do for them that's fixing a problem for a lot of their peers. Hey, I know they're probably really busy, but I'm wondering if they know about this insight that could be impacting their business. I want you to think about, how could I get a conversation started with this person, and choose the conversation over the conversion, the meeting. Start the conversation first. The only thing that you want to focus on going in is, how can I just get this person comfortable talking to me? All right. Lastly, I find this one to be pretty good. It's really just a radical acceptance type of situation. So I'm a really big fan of UFC. Particularly, there's a guy, John Jones. He's been trying to move up into heavyweight for a while. John Jones normally fights at 205 pounds. So it's light heavyweight. He wants to move up into a division where he's going to fight people that weigh 265 pounds. So it looks like there's some UFC fighters here in the chat. So he wants to fight people that are literally 60 pounds heavier than he normally fights. There's a guy, Francis Ngannou, who's the current heavyweight champion of the world, and the guy is like a human-sized Hulk. This guy's just a beast. And what everyone keeps asking John Jones over the last year and a half is, are you scared of this guy? And you know what John Jones said? He said, yeah, I am. I did not expect him to say that, by the way. He said, yeah, I am scared of him. But you know what? I've accepted that the worst thing that could possibly happen to me is that he knocks me out. Maybe he even breaks my jaw. But I've accepted that as a potential outcome. I'm okay with that. I can live with that. And I thought that was kind of interesting. He's accepted that the worst case scenario is that he gets knocked out and embarrassed in front of tens of thousands or millions of people, depending on how many people buy that pay-per-view. And that he's accepted the fact that he could maybe get his jaw broken too. So what I want you to think about is, you know what? What's the worst case scenario that could happen? What is the worst possible outcome from this cold call? And could you live with that outcome? For a lot of us, the worst thing is going to be that the person's super rude to us and hangs up on you. Are you okay with being like, okay, they rejected this phone call. They didn't reject me personally. I don't have any personal problems that this person rejected. But are you okay with accepting that the worst case scenario is that someone hangs up on you? I mean, is it really that big of a deal? And will that person even remember you like the next day if you decided to call them, or the next week? So think about, how could I just accept the worst case scenario and have comfort going into this call, knowing that, you know, potentially this person doesn't want to talk to me, which is a pretty good percentage chance, you guys, that the person doesn't want to talk to you because you're a salesperson. Like, just accept that. It's totally okay. All right. So those are some tactics that you can use for call reluctance. And Sean, you said, what about the fear that your brand will be associated with spam calling? Word travels fast, that one call might spoil the batch. Sean, if you do what I'm about to show you next with the cold calling framework, people are not going to associate with spam dialing. People are not going to associate you with being a spammer. But we have this scenario that we play out in our head that if I make a cold call and it goes bad, that this C-level person is now going to send a email to all thousands of people on their team and say, do not pick up any phone calls from this person, Jason at Blissful Prospect. Like, that's just not going to happen. Right? So this fear that we have, let's just like radically accept. Again, if we go back to that, let's choose the conversation over the conversion. And let's sit in the seat of the other person to think about what it's like to reject us instead of focusing so much on what it's like to be rejected. Once we've picked a technique that we like, from there, it's just about making it a habit. So before we move on to the cold call structure here, I'd love to know from you in the chat, could you share with me what's been most helpful for you from this? What's actionable for you? If you deal with call reluctance or any other type of reluctance, what did you take away from this that could help the next time you pick up the phone and decide to make some calls? Yeah, John says worst case. Yeah, radical acceptance, accepting the worst, not caring about the reaction. You guys, who cares? Like, some people are assholes. You know, 1 out of every 100 people that you interact with in the world are going to be assholes. Like, that's just how it is. And you're going to come across those people when you cold call. That doesn't make what you're doing bad. That doesn't make you a bad person. Some people just don't want to talk to you. That's totally okay if they don't want to talk to you. Yeah, accept the worst case scenario. YOLO, Brian says. Okay. Cool. Yeah, Samantha says only 1 out of 100. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. So we've talked about call reluctance. What I want to do now, let me open up the little section here, is let's talk about how we structure the cold call. All right. So if we look at the structure of the call, we're going to want to break this down into 3 sections. All right. We have an intro, we have a hook, and then we have a close. The reason why we want to break it down into sections like this is I want you to kind of pick apart the cold call so that you can work on specific areas. All right. So if we look at this, this is usually the first 30 to 60 seconds. All right. So here's where I want some interaction from you guys here. Let me know in the chat if we're going to reverse engineer the cold call. If we're going to reverse engineer this, we need to think about what it's like to experience being cold called. Okay. So what I want your help from in the chat with real quick is let me know, what's it like to be on the receiving end of a call when your prospect decides to pick up their phone from an unknown number and say hello? What are some of the things that you think is going on through their head? What do you think is some of the dialogue that's going through their head? Yeah, bothersome. No, the salesperson, robocall, who is calling? Who is this? Time waster. Oh, great, another sales call. Scam. I don't like robots. Why are you calling me? Who's interrupting my lunch? Someone trying to sell me something. This isn't the call I was looking for. Okay, all of this is great. So what we're going to do first, you guys, it's super simple. All right. We're going to, 1, do what I call remove the surprise. And 2, we're going to use a really basic permission-based opener. The first 30 seconds of the call, by the way, this is really probably more like the first 15 seconds. It's less about what you say and more how you say it. All right. The tonality is really important. The prospect needs to feel like they're talking to a peer. So it's going to sound something like this. Hey, Will, Jason here with Blissful Prospecting. Look, I know I probably caught you in the middle of something, but you got a minute for me to tell you why I'm calling, and then you can let me know if you want to keep chatting? Sandler calls these upfront contracts. I like to call them permission-based openers. Any variation of that works really well. So what I want you to pay attention to, again, really closely, is the tonality and the speed and the pace. Hey, Michael, Jason with Blissful Prospecting here. Look, I know I probably caught you in the middle of something, but You got a minute for me to tell you why I'm calling, and then you can let me know if you want to keep chatting? So pace, you really want to slow down. A lot of times what I hear is folks talking way too fast. And then I really want to enunciate the words. A lot of times what happens is we're trying to get out what we're saying so quickly that it sounds like a blur. It sounds like a Charlie Brown, kind of situation where it's like, hey, this is Jason with Blissful Prospecting. Look, I know I probably catch you in the middle of something, but you got 30 seconds for me to tell you why I'm calling, and then you can let me know if you want to keep chatting. Way too fast. Think about how a peer would talk to another peer. So Matt said, asking for permission is giving them an opportunity to say no. It is. It is. And you know what's kind of interesting is that when you give people opportunities to say no and you give them a choice and allow them to opt in to the conversation, oftentimes they will choose yes over no. 9 times out of 10, this should work. This should get you to the next part of the call. If it's not, you need to revisit your tonality. When I make these calls, I never get shut down at the permission-based opener. Usually the response is, yeah, go ahead. What do you got? Or they might chuckle a little bit if they've never heard it before. But the tonality is really important. So Leonardo, asking for permission, is it too much of a salesperson? No. What a normal salesperson would do is be really pushy and just bulldoze their way through the call. All right, so we want to slow it down. Brett, you guys are funny. Okay. Yeah, Theo has a really good point. He says, to that point, if they say no, at least you don't have to waste your time. It's okay if they say no. What I wanted to get them to do is I want them to opt in to the conversation. All right. So again, we're thinking about reverse engineering. We're putting this call together in a way that's a little bit different from what the prospect might be expecting. Okay. Help me out in the chat here. What do you think a typical salesperson would do next? They get yes. So you say, hey, can I get a minute to tell you why I'm calling? You can let me know if you want to keep chatting. Prospect says yes. What's the next thing that people usually will do? They'll pitch. They'll sell. Right? They'll do elevator pitch. Great. Yeah, Colin. Again, this is Jason with ABC Robotics Solution. I was giving you a call because we're helping manufacturers like you automate so that they don't have to use welders anymore. And it's actually leading to 20% increase in profit margins. They're not running into production delays. And I wanted to set up a meeting with you so that we could talk about how to automate some of the parts that you're having trouble automating right now. It's like, whoo, right? It's a lot of information, elevator pitch. The prospect, by the way, is expecting to be pitched right there. So what I want you to think about is how in your personal life do you get people talking about themselves? Because that's the goal at this point of the call. I want to get the prospect talking about themselves. So I want to test you guys a little bit here. How could we get a person to talk about themselves? Yeah, we could ask questions. Let's be a little more specific. You could ask about problems. You could talk about them. Ask people to tell you about themselves. I want to be really careful with that, Leslie, because if I then ask you, well, hey, Leslie, tell me a little bit more about what you're working on at ABC Company when it relates to your production. That doesn't really demonstrate business acumen. What that demonstrates is I'm a salesperson trying to figure out how to sell to this person. So what I want to do is, and I don't really want to hammer them with problems yet either, you guys. I just want to get the person talking about what they're working on. Let's start the conversation a little more positive. How can we get them to talk about what they're working on? Instead of using an elevator pitch, this is where, if you guys have been following my content, this is where we do what's called a priority drop. Okay. And you guys were talking about, a lot of people are asking if this is going to be recorded. Yes, it absolutely will be, and the replay will be sent out to you on Friday. Okay. So what I want to think about here is this priority drop. And I'm going to give you guys a little formula that you can use. So Logan, you're not going to ask, is chat a priority for you this year? We're going to talk about something that's bigger than what, okay? So I want to give you guys a quick, because this is where I see a lot of people get hung up. Okay, Skip Miller, you guys should check him out. He wrote a book called Selling Above and Below the Line. Skip Miller's the man. Reach out to him on LinkedIn. Let him know that I told you to reach out to him. So he has this concept called above the line and below the line. So above the line, this is your VPs, your C levels. Below the line is more like a manager or user, let's say, of the product. Yeah, Skip's awesome, George. I agree with you 100%. So how does this apply to the priority drop? Well, turns out that above the line buyers, they care a lot about things that are strategic, long term. So they care about months and years, and they care about these particular outcomes. How does this tie in with revenue, profit, or reducing risk in some sort of way? This is a very simplified version of looking at it, by the way. The BTLs, the below the line folks that are maybe users of the product, managing people that would be using the product or interacting with your service, these people are very tactical. And they think mostly day to day and weekly. And what they're focused on is time, convenience, like fixing problems. All right. Where we can run into trouble is if we use below the line messaging with above the line people. Okay. I'm going to give you some examples of what a good priority drop and a bad priority drop sound like. Okay. So let me give you some examples, and I have some opened up here with some other clients that I've worked with. Okay. All right. So let's pretend the prospect, VP of Ops at a manufacturing company, and this client that I work with sells an automated welding solution. Here's what a bad example of this would sound like. Okay, so again, I'm going to give you an example of below the line messaging that was used on an above the line prospect. Okay, so I'm going to say something like this. Hey, this is Jason with ABC Automation. Look, I know I probably caught you in the middle of something here, but you got 30 seconds for me to tell you why I'm calling? You could let me know if you want to keep chatting. Prospect says yes. Hey, appreciate it. So I've been talking to a lot of VPs of operations at manufacturing companies that manufacture trailers, like it looks like you guys are. And one thing I keep hearing is one of two things. One is a focus around welders. So how do we hire welders faster? How do we get more responses off our job ads? How do we interview them better, retain them, etc.? The second thing that I'm hearing is around lead times. So how do we get our workers to work faster, show up to work on time, get their stuff done faster, and really just overall increase the efficiency? Now, that is a really bad example of a priority drop because a VP of operations, they don't care about welders right now. They don't care about lead times in the work that people are doing. They care about reducing lead times, right? So that was a really bad example of really kind of stock boilerplate messaging that would apply to someone that's maybe boots on the ground. Okay. So here's what a better priority drop sound like that's more in line with a VP of Ops and what they would care about strategically, and most importantly, the results that they're looking to drive. So here's what that sounds like. So prospect says, yeah, totally. What do you got, Jason? Well, hey, appreciate the time. I've been talking to a lot of operations leaders lately at manufacturing companies, particularly that are manufacturing trailer parts like yours. And I hear a focus around one of two things. One is around the labor shortage. So I noticed that you guys are hiring 3-4 welders right now. And specifically what I'm hearing is how do we find more skilled welders to deal with this labor shortage so that we're not so that our production is not impacted and we don't have to move back orders. What's up, Corey? Two, the second thing I'm hearing is around lead times. So how do we decrease our lead time so that we can stay competitive, keep our customers happy, and improve our bottom line? So what I'm talking about there is these above the line value props, right? These above the line things that this person is trying to accomplish. All right. So our priority drop, what we want to do that's super, super, super important here is we want to talk about the category, and I'll give you guys kind of the formula here. I'm going to copy and paste it into the chat. That's the formula that you use for the priority drop statement. What's the overarching category, and how do we employ this tactic or strategy to drive this result? Super, super important. All right, I'm going to keep moving. So when we do this, what's pretty cool about this is this allows us to filter the conversation before we start to ask questions. Oh yeah, sorry, you guys. Let me repost that little formula. There you go. So now what I can do is filter the conversation. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to question stack around problems that they might be having. The reason why I don't want to start peppering them with problem-based questions at the beginning and to do the priority drop instead is that I might miss. I might talk about something or ask questions about something that they're not having a problem with. Okay? So I got another, kind of example that I could use with you guys as well. So an example of a question that you could ask and question stack around. And what we want to do, the formula for question stacking is context plus question. So instead of saying, what software are you guys using for your electronic document capture, I'm going to preface that question with some context to demonstrate business acumen. The worst thing you can do is ask a stupid question. Because if you ask a stupid question, you don't look like a peer to that prospect, and you're going to start getting a lot of objections. So if you get a ton of objections in the middle of the call, it's usually because the questions you're asking are not very good. So question stacking sounds like this. So let's say I do the priority drop, and the person's like, yeah, we are using a very manual, this is a different example. We are using a very manual process for our clinical trials right now. So what I'm going to ask then is I'm going to ask a question around a problem that might have using manual document capture. Hey, actually, David, I hear a lot of folks that I talk to are using manual paper processes. And the thing that I keep hearing is that it's really expensive to collect the data. And they end up doing a lot of double data entry that pushes the clinical trial back beyond the deadline that you guys want to meet. I'm really curious, how do you make sure that your deadlines are not impacted with the paper process that you're using right now? So I'm stacking the problem in front of the question. I'm putting the problem in front of the question. I'm not going to ask, what's your biggest challenge with XYZ? Because I should know that as a sales rep coming in. I should know that. I'm going to ask questions around really common problems that I know they're probably having, or maybe lack of functionality in their tool that's creating a problem. So I'm going to question stack around those problems. And then what I'm going to do is summarize. And that's going to get me into the close where we get agreement. So let's say I ask the questions of the prospect and they're like, yeah, we're using a paper solution. It's impacting our deadlines, et cetera, et cetera. I'm then going to take control of the call and I'm going to cut the call short at that point. Once I get what I need to determine if there's a good opportunity here for a meeting, I'm going to cut the call short. So I'm just going to summarize back to them what I heard. So I'm going to say, hey, Jeremy, so what I heard from you today is that you guys are using a paper solution. It is creating a lot of manual work for you guys to collect the data with all the double data entry. And it sounds like you're worried that the trial might take 16 weeks instead of 12. The get agreement piece. Did I miss anything? So I'm just going to ask here, did I miss anything? I'm making it all about the prospect. You notice that we haven't talked about ourselves at all. Then what you're going to do is you're going to transition into scheduling the meeting. All right. So I'm going to get agreement. Prospect will either say, yeah, I would add this to, or, hey, yeah, you got everything, Jason. They might ask you at that point, well, hey, what do you guys do? A lot of times they won't. So what you can do is you could say, well, hey, based on what I heard, I definitely think there's a fit here for us to potentially help you out. And if nothing else, I'd love to share what companies like X, Y, and Z are doing to solve some of those problems that you just mentioned. How about we unpack this at a time when I'm not calling you in the middle of your day? Do you have your calendar handy? So I'm going to schedule the meeting. I'm going to get agreement. I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to schedule the meeting. I'm going to say, hey, sounds like something that we might be able to help out with and share some insights around. How about we unpack this a little bit more and I'm not calling you in the middle of your day. Do you have your calendar handy? Boom. Then you're going to go into a confirmation process. The big piece of advice I have here is get them to accept the calendar invite on the call. This is a really good best practice if you're dealing with cancellations. Get them to accept the calendar invite on the call. All right. So we could do a couple things from here. I want to check in with everyone. Let me know in the chat, what's been your biggest takeaway from this framework? What do you feel like you could start using immediately to increase the conversions of your cold calls? Drop it into the chat for me. Yeah, context with questions, priority drop. Be more inquisitive, Rebecca says. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, priority drops, context plus questions, Zach says. Yeah, don't pitch. Yeah, Tyler says accepting the calendar invite on the call. That's a really, really big one. Yeah, above and below the line concept. Thanks, Skip Miller, for that one. Yeah, priority dropping, question stacking. Jason liked hearing some of the examples. Yeah, problems before questions, tailored conversation. Okay. Okay. Did I miss anything? Okay. All right. We can do a couple things right now. We have about 15 minutes left. I have time to do one of two things. We can talk more about cold calling. Specifically, there's a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I can get into your questions around the framework and all that kind of good stuff. But we won't be able to cover objection handling if we do that. Or what we could do is cover objection handling, and I could go into that framework, and we can spend the next 10, 15 minutes kind of going through that together. What do you guys want to do? Give me a, yeah, let me know in the chat. Do you want to hear objection handling, or do you want to hear cold calling? Isaac says, I don't care about objections. Isaac, you would definitely be, you're in the minority, it looks like, man. So, okay, let's cover objections. All right. And again, the recording will be sent out to you afterwards. I have a workbook that I'm going to send to you guys at the end too. Let's talk about objections. Okay, so I think the most complicated part about objections is that what can be frustrating is if we know an objection is likely going to be coming, like a not interested, or we already have a solution for that, or we're already using XYZ provider. What can feel really frustrating is knowing what the objections are and not having a good way, to kind of deal with them. What I want you to wrap your head around is that we actually want to welcome a no. It's not about turning no's into yeses. It's not about stumping the prospect. It's not about doing any of those kind of things. I actually want the prospect to give me objections. If they're giving me objections, we're having a real conversation. They're being candid with me. I want to achieve a level of candor in the conversation with the prospect. Okay. The way that we can do that is by really leveraging two things and then a third thing that I'm going to talk about. What we want to do is get better at really understanding what the prospect is saying. So let me actually give you some pointers here. If we can get better at listening, we're going to get really good at objection handling. Specifically, what I want to talk to you about is active listening. So I'm going to write this question down. What is the prospect thinking that they're not sharing? So what I want you to think about is in your personal life, when someone says, I'm fine, what does that really mean? Like, what is that person thinking that they're not saying, right? What are they thinking that they're not sharing with you? We want to assume that there's, yeah, John says they're not fine. Definitely, right? When someone says, I'm fine, oh, we'll find that they're obviously not fine in that scenario. So what I want you to think about is when a prospect gives you an objection, they're probably not telling you the entire story. There's some assumptions that we can make based on what they share, okay? The other thing that I want you to think about is what's the question behind the question? All right. So when a prospect says something like, well, hey, what do you guys do? Or hey, are you guys an XYZ? Are you a staffing agency? Are you a software? Wait, what customers have you worked with? The question behind the question is, can I trust you? Are you credible? Have you done work with my peers? Do you know about my industry? We need to be really thinking about these things. The most important thing that we need to do is we need to think about shift versus support responses. This whole philosophy is based on a book called You're Not Listening from Kate Murphy. And the book, by the way, was assigned reading from my wife. Some work for my wife. It's called You're Not Listening. So this concept of shift versus support sounds something like this. So let's say that we met up for the first time, whoever, let's say Mike, okay? Me and Mike meet up for the first time. And let's say that Mike says, I play guitar. And immediately when Mike's like, yeah, I play guitar, I go into, well, dude, I play guitar too. I've been playing since 7th grade. I've been trying to learn this Van Halen song right now, Running with the Devil. It's really kind of kicking my ass. And I really like Eddie Van Halen. And some of the stuff I've been looking into with guitar is, kind of upgrading the amp. Like that's an example of a shift response. I've shifted Mike saying, I like guitar. I've shifted the entire focus of that conversation onto me. What we want to do instead is the exact opposite. So if Mike said, hey, I play guitar, a support response sounds like this. Oh, how long have you been playing guitar? Who's your favorite guitar player? What kind of guitar do you have? Right? You want to not shift. Don't think about how do I relate with what this person's sharing. I want you to think about, oh, I wonder how this makes this person feel. I wonder what this person's going through. Like, I want you to be curious about the other person. So when someone says that they're using another provider or another vendor, I want you to get really curious about how that's going instead of shifting immediately into a rebuttal. Okay. The biggest thing that we need to do is you guys have to get rid of these shift responses. Stop making the focus of the conversation on you. Oftentimes we feel like when someone has an objection, we need to defend ourselves and we need a rebuttal. We need to one up. We need to stump the prospect. Please just don't do that. All right. It's not doing you any favors. You need to provide a support response. George says you need to reverse. Exactly. So the way that we do this is really simple. There's 3 parts to it. We want to empathize. We want to validate. And by doing these 2 things, that helps us disarm and better understand where the prospect's coming from. And then we can go in for our offer. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple really practical examples here. Let's use shallow objections first. Like not interested, not right now, I'm busy, I'm about to step into a meeting, etc. So in order to have empathy for someone, we have to know what they're thinking. All right? The cool thing is that the prospect, what they're thinking that they're not saying should be pretty obvious to you. We could make some pretty good assumptions, all right? So help me out in the chat here. When a prospect says, oh, we're not interested, not right now, I'm busy, what do you think they're thinking that they are not saying? Help me out in the chat. What are they thinking that they are not sharing? I don't have time for this. I don't want to take this call. I want to hang up. There's no value. I'm talking to a salesperson. Call me later. It's not relevant. Yeah, what are they selling? Yeah. So they might be busy. Maybe they don't like talking to salespeople. Yeah, not a priority. Why did I answer? Not interested. Yeah, I don't get it. Don't need. Yeah, no need. Okay. These are all really good. So what we need to do now when we're talking through this objection and quote unquote handling it is to empathize with the person. We're just going to say back to them what we think that they're thinking. All right. There's a lot of different ways that we can say this. But if someone says, hey, not interested, I'm just going to say, hey, sounds like I might have caught you in the middle of something. Or, hey, sounds like you're really busy right now. Validate, which is totally understandable since I'm calling you out of the blue here. All right. So I'm going to agree with the person. I'm not going to disagree with them. I'm going to agree with the person. Chris Voss talks a lot about never split the difference, like labeling. He didn't come up with that concept. It's kind of an old concept in psychology, but you could use those labeling terms if you want to. Yeah, it's a great book. Sounds like, looks like, etc. So if someone says not interested, I'm just going to say what they're probably thinking. Hey, sounds like I might have caught you in the middle of something. Empathize. Validate, which is totally understandable because I'm calling you out of the blue. Or hey, which is totally understandable because you obviously didn't ask me to call you. So I'm acknowledging the salesperson thing. All right. So John says, well, where do you go from there? Be patient, John. I'm going to get to that. All right. So now we can go into the offer piece. So we can do a couple things. We can go in for another permission-based ask, or we could use this approach that I like a lot. You look a lot like. So I tend to go back to the permission-based here if the not interested happens at the very beginning of the call. So if I do a priority drop, or sorry, before I get to the priority drop, if the person's like, oh, not interested, I might say, hey, all good. Sounds like I'm going to catch you in the middle of something, which is totally understandable because I'm calling you out of the blue here, but you got a minute for me to tell you why I'm calling? Because I did do some research on your company and noticed you guys were doing X, Y, Z. And then you can let me know if this is relevant for you or not. Does that sound fair? So you can go in for another permission-based ask, or if you're a little bit later in the call, you can do the you looked a lot like. So let's say you do a priority drop, you ask some questions, and the person's like, I don't know if I'm really interested in this. We could say, hey, totally understandable, Mike. Sounds like I might have been off base in reaching out to you, but I was curious. You looked a lot like ABC Company, who was also, hiring in their sales development team right now. And one of the things they were really prioritized in doing that we helped them with is reducing ramp time from about 12 weeks to 8 weeks. Was I totally off in thinking you might want to hear more about that? Or would it hurt to share more? So that you looked a lot like is you're basically going to tell a customer story of someone that's in a very similar position to them. Hey, you looked a lot like this company that was going through this problem or wanted to accomplish this thing. And this thing kept on getting in the way. Was I often thinking that this might apply to what you're doing at XYZ company? Or can I share a little bit more? So that's what you're going to do. Empathize, validate, offer. We don't have time to go through the gambit of objections, but you can insert any objection into there. Hey, we're using XYZ competitor. Hey, sounds like you guys are taken care of. Validate. Plus, Leslie, I noticed that you've been at the company for about 10 years, so I imagine you've put a lot of thought into this. Offer. But I was reaching out to you because you looked a lot like this company XYZ that was using that solution. And one of the things they really liked about it was that it was super easy to use. It integrated with everything. One of the things that was not so great is that their field team couldn't get access to the solution through their phone. It was kind of a deal breaker for them. What's your experience been, if you don't mind sharing? So I can say, hey, this person was using this solution. They liked this thing and they kind of didn't like this thing. What are your thoughts? I'm going to offer something that they like and something that they don't like. All right, cool. Okay, I'm going to pause here. I got one more thing that I'm going to share with you. What's your biggest takeaway? Because we don't have time to really go into this much more. What's your biggest takeaway from the EVO objection handling framework? What can you start applying to your objection handling method? Drop it into the chat for me. What's been most helpful for you around objection handling? Yeah, empathize, validate, permission-based, disarm. You guys are so good at interacting here and participating. I'm loving the participation today. This has been a lot of fun. Cool. All right, you guys are awesome. Okay, I got one more little surprise for you. Okay, so here we go. I put in, I have a little worksheet for you guys. I'm going to share it with in the chat here. So what you're going to get access to in this document is this cold calling from reluctant to confident framework. So you got the call reluctance framework in here, the conversation first, meeting second framework in here, and looky here. This is the same thing that I do with companies, and all of our reps in Outbound Squad is a little talk track template for you. So what you can do with this talk track that's pretty badass is you can just plug in your priority statements here. And then you can build your questions here. and then you have everything else scripted out that we talked about before. So I'm going to share this in the chat. One other thing that you'll find in here too, there's a little bit more information. If you want more help, we have a program called Outbound Squad. There's a little bit more information here on it, but we have 75 folks in there right now. And if you're looking for more structure, coaching from myself and a guy, Ethan Parker, who's very, very good at cold calling, accountability, a community, all that stuff, there's a way that you can check it out and apply there in the document too. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I wanted to share this with you so that you guys have it. All right, and let me just make sure we all got access here. Boom. There you go. Just dropped it into the chat. Make sure to grab that before we hop off. I'm going to send out the replay to this on Friday so that you have it. Make sure to grab that document. I'll give you guys a second. And again, this has been super fun. We had, I think at one point we had about 650 people on the webinar today. So awesome, awesome turnout. I appreciate all of the interaction that you guys have had, and I hope you get a ton of value from the recording and the worksheet. And if you're looking for some extra help and you want to level up your outbound chops, we have SDRs and BDRs in there, and about 80% of the Outbound Squad group is account executives and full cycle salespeople. So if you're really looking to surround yourself with a group of badasses and get coaching from myself and get more in-depth content that we went through today, make sure to check that out and apply. Information's in the document. Yeah, to save this document, what you can do is go to File and then make a copy. So go to File, make a copy, and you can download your own version. That's all I got. Appreciate the participation and the interaction today, everyone. We'll see you soon. Talk to you later. Have a good rest of your week.